listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For today's episode, I had the opportunity to interview Natasha Tynes. Natasha, who has considerable experience in the news media world, is the author of the speculative literary novel They Called Me Wyatt, and she has also written short stories. Additionally, Natasha is currently writing a series of books that will be called The Tales of Karma. I'm here with Natasha Tynes. Did I pronounce your name correctly?
Yes, that's correct.
Who is the author of They Called Me Wyatt and has extensive experience as a journalist, news media contributor, and communications professional. Natasha, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Thank you for having me, Aaron. I'm happy to be here.
I'm going to start with current events. Now, as we're all aware of, the Islamic fundamentalist terror group Hamas launched a vicious terrorist attack a few days ago on a music festival in Israel, and now Israel and Hamas are at war again. What are your thoughts about the terror attack on the music festival in Israel and the ongoing Israel-Hamas war?
It's definitely a tragedy and shouldn't have happened. Any loss of life is tragic, and we all condemn the loss of innocent civilians. So it's really tragic and sad. Another thing worth noting that the media also should look at the context behind this, and what happens when you lock people in an open air prison for 20 years, and it leads to desperation and these acts, so it's a cycle of violence that unfortunately we're not gonna see any end to it soon.
Now, feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners. I know that's normally my first question I ask guests on here, but this will be the second one because there was current events I had to ask you about.
Yes, of course. My name is Natasha Tynes, and I'm a Jordanian-American author, writer, and a journalist. And I write fiction and nonfiction, and my novel, They Called Me Wyatt, was published a few years ago, and it's set between the US and the Middle East, and it's a speculative murder mystery. And I'm currently working on a 3-book series called Tales of Karma. And I'm also a ghostwriter. I write memoirs for people who want their life stories to be told.
Now, you mentioned a little bit about They Called Me Wyatt just a short time ago, but without spoiling too much of that book, could you go into more detail about what that book is about?
Yeah, of course. So it's a murder mystery set between Jordan, the country where I was born, and the US. And it's about, it starts, the first scene, we see a woman being killed by being pushed off the roof of the building, and then the police rules her death as suicide. And then after she dies, she gets reincarnated in the body of a 5-year-old, and he is in Seattle, and he is trying to communicate with his parents, but he's speech delayed, and she lives within his mind because she got reincarnated inside of him. And so she's trying to speak through him to try to solve her own mystery. Then the boy grows up, and he just so attached to the Middle East for reason he doesn't know, and then he finds out about that murder by mere chance, and then he gets so attached to that murder that happened 25 years prior, and he gets obsessed on solving this murder. So we keep reading to see if this woman, whose name is Siwar, gets justice after all.
Now, do you prefer self-publishing or traditional publishing for books, and why?
Sure. So there are pros and cons to each way of publishing. So with self-publishing, you have complete control. You have control over the cover. You have access to all the sales reports. Of course, if your book sells well, you make more income because you get the majority of the royalty. And that's not the case in traditional publishing. However, traditional publishing, they help you with marketing, and you don't have to pay anything out of pocket, because usually the traditional publisher covers the cost of the designer and the editing, while if you self-publish, usually if you want your book to be of high quality, you have to pay for an editor and for a cover designer. And when it comes to marketing, sometimes you have to pay for ads like Amazon ads and Facebook ads and others. So these are the pros and cons. And I will tell writers, if you wanna wait it out and wait the time it takes to be traditionally published, and you want a query agent, and if that's your life dream, then by all means go for it. But realize that this is gonna take a while, a few years. But if you feel that you wanna publish your words sooner, you want the word to see what you have to say earlier on, so maybe self-publishing is the way to go. And now there are lots of platforms that help you do this easily and quickly, and the stigma around self-publishing is less these days, and many authors are doing it.
You briefly mentioned you're currently working on a 3-part series of books called The Tales of Karma. Without spoiling too much of your upcoming series, what will that be about?
Sure. It's also speculative fiction, and it's about an immigrant from the Middle East who settles in the U.S. suburbs, and she's trying to live a normal suburban existence, but she has a talent or a power that very few people know about it. Not even her husband knows about it, which is she sees the future of people who touch her. So if anyone touches her by mistake, like shake hands or brushes against her, she sees snippets of their future life, and she tries to hide this or control this powers she has, but it's really difficult. So she walks her dog around the neighborhood, and then she starts finding out about secrets that's happening around the neighborhood. And so the drama surrounds this, and there's this person in the neighborhood who knows about her and follows her and try to stops her and makes her life difficult. So that is what the book is about.
You've also written some short stories, and what are some short stories that you've written, and what publications have featured some of your short stories?
Sure. I published almost, I think, 4 short stories in different publications. So there is one called Geometry. It's about a couple who were madly in love, and then what happened to the relationship after a certain incident that tears them apart. This was published in a publication based in New Zealand called Geometry. I also had a short story published in a publication in Portland, and it's about a man who working really hard to get a visa to travel to the United States, and we see his efforts to get the US visa and what happens to him. I also have a story called The Agency. It's about a woman who runs a matchmaking agency in Jordan, and all the drama that surrounds running a matchmaking agency. And then I have another one called Under Contract, which is about how the sale of a house next door affect the relationship of a couple living next door, and how would that turn their side upside down.
Now, how do you find time to write? As someone who uh, writes books, is a ghostwriter, does other forms of writing, and what is your typical writing routine like?
Yeah, so I do writing for a living. So I'm writing nonstop, whether it's for a client, whether it's for my own creative writing, whether it's a book, for my own newsletter, for my social media. So I usually I'm an early riser. I wake up at 6 a.m. And I try to work until 3 p.m. And I also try to go to the gym sometime between 6 a.m. and 3 p.m. And the reason is 3 p.m. because that's when I pick up my kids, and then, the activities, making dinner, all of that. And then I pick up later on, like between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. I try to catch up on emails and other stuff. But I try to focus on doing my creative writing in the early morning, because I feel that's where my highest level of energy is, and I can be, happier and more focused, but the night is usually for admin stuff, or answering emails, or sending invoices, or stuff like that. But most of my creative writing happens in the early hours of the morning.
You're also a podcaster and you host Read and Write with Natasha. What can a listener expect from a typical episode of your podcast?
What's the topic, you mean, or
What
the
contents in a typical episode of your podcast?
yeah. Yeah, sure. So the podcast focuses on interviewing authors and talking about their writing and publishing journey. And we also talk about tips on publishing, writing, what tools do they use, what obstacles they face. So it's for anyone who's either a published author who wants to listen or hear about stories from other authors, or aspiring writers or authors who want to publish a book but a bit intimidated, they don't know where to start. So they can find tips, they can find inspiration by listening to these stories on my podcast.
Tell us more about your background. This is my final question. Tell us more about your background as a journalist and a news media contributor.
Yeah, I worked as a journalist for almost 20 years. I have a master's in international journalism from City University in London. So I worked for a number of organizations in the US, outside of the US, in the Middle East. I worked for the Jordan Times. I worked for Al Jazeera. I was based in Doha, Qatar for 2 years as well, where I worked for Al Jazeera. I still contribute to a number of publications in the Middle East and outside of the Middle East. I have bylines in publications such as the Washington Post, Elle Magazine, Esquire, Huffington Post, and others.
Natasha, you are a wonderful guest for this podcast. I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author podcast, and I'll include the Spotify link to your podcast in the text description of the episode once it's uploaded.
Thank you very much for having me, Aaron. I really enjoyed chatting with you.
I'll provide a link to the Read and Write with Natasha podcast in the text description of this episode. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.witsite.com/author AAC. You can follow me on Facebook at Author AAC and on Instagram at AAC Scribe. Copyright 2023, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.